In 1974, Linda Whitfield stood frozen in a grocery store aisle, staring at a receipt that made no sense. The same cart of groceries that cost her $12 the month before now cost almost $16. Prices weren't just rising, they were rising every single week. Millions of American housewives felt that same cold panic. But somewhere between the ledgers, the cash envelopes, and the quiet kitchen table conversations, these women discovered a forgotten system of survival. A system so effective, some of it still works better than anything we use today. If you've ever felt like your paycheck disappears faster than it used to, stay with me. Subscribe, like, and comment 1974 if you're ready, because the biggest secret from this story is coming later, and it changed everything for families who used it. The year was 1974, and America was living through something economists didn't even have a name for yet. Inflation was climbing, wages were standing still. Newspapers called it stagflation, but for women like Linda, it simply felt like the ground shifting beneath their feet. She remembered her mother's warning years earlier: never trust the sticker price, trust the math. At the time, Linda hadn't understood what that meant. Now, standing in that aisle with a receipt trembling in her hand, she finally did. She wasn't alone. Across kitchen tables in Ohio, Texas, and Pennsylvania, women were quietly relearning a skill their own mothers had used during harder decades. It wasn't a hack, it wasn't a shortcut, it was a forgotten kind of math, one built on patience instead of panic. Compare that to today. Susan, a mother of two in suburban Ohio, scrolls through her grocery app watching prices change overnight. Her cart total jumps 30 cents here, 50 cents there, and by the time she reaches checkout, she barely recognizes the number on the screen. It feels eerily familiar to what Linda experienced 50 years earlier, except now the confusion hides behind smaller packages and shrinking boxes instead of printed price tags. Back in 1974, Linda didn't have an app to blame. She had a notebook, a pencil, and a stubborn refusal to be fooled twice. She began writing down prices from 3 different stores, comparing them line by line at her kitchen table after the kids were asleep. Her husband thought it was excessive. Her neighbor Patricia thought it was smart. Within a month, Patricia was doing the same thing. What neither woman expected was how much they'd been missing simply by glancing at a shelf tag. The real story wasn't in the total price at all. It was hiding in a number most shoppers walked right past without a second glance, printed in tiny type beneath the label. That number was about to change the way an entire generation of women shopped, budgeted, and thought about money. Because the real secret wasn't the price on the shelf, it was the price per ounce. And once Linda learned to see it, she could never unsee it again. Linda's notebook filled quickly that winter. She wrote down brand names, sizes, and totals, but the column that mattered most was the smallest one: cost per ounce. A large bottle of dish soap looked cheaper at first glance, but once she divided the price by the ounces inside, the smaller bottle sitting beside it was actually the better deal. It seemed like a small discovery. It wasn't small at all. This single habit, dividing price by quantity before buying anything, became the backbone of an entire survival strategy. Women across the country started carrying pocket calculators into grocery stores, some tucked into purses next to grocery lists written in careful cursive. Deborah, a mother of 3 in Pittsburgh, kept hers clipped to her coupon binder. She called it her truth teller because it never lied the way advertising did. The genius of unit pricing wasn't complicated. It simply forced shoppers to stop trusting packaging and start trusting numbers. A large box wasn't always the best value. A name brand can wasn't always worth the extra dime. The math didn't care about clever labels or cheerful mascots on the front of a box. It only cared about what you were actually paying for, what you actually got. This matters just as much today, maybe more. Modern shoppers face something Linda never had to think about by name: shrinkflation. The box looks the same, the price looks the same, but the amount inside has quietly shrunk. A bag of chips that once fed a family now leaves half a plate empty. Without checking the unit price, most people never notice the difference until the pattern repeats 3 or 4 times in a row. As Linda's confidence with unit pricing grew, something else began shifting in stores across America. Bright, colorful packaging started sharing shelf space with plain white labels marked simply cornflakes or peanut butter in bold black letters. These were the first generic brands, sometimes called no-name products, and at first many shoppers were suspicious of them. Linda's neighbor Margaret refused to buy them for months, convinced they'd taste inferior or that neighbors would judge her cart. But one Tuesday, out of desperation more than curiosity, she bought the generic peanut butter instead of her usual brand. Her children didn't notice the difference. She saved nearly a third of what she normally spent. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Within weeks, women who had once felt embarrassed buying generic products started comparing them openly, almost proudly, at church gatherings and backyard fences. The stigma cracked because the math simply made too much sense to ignore. What none of them realized yet was that this shift in mindset, learning to separate brand loyalty from actual value, was about to spill into every corner of their households. It started with peanut butter. It didn't end there. And the next lesson would touch something far more personal than a grocery cart: what actually ended up on the family dinner table each night. By the spring of 1974, meat prices had climbed so sharply that some families cut their beef purchases in half. Linda remembered standing at the butcher counter, watching the price per pound climb week after week and feeling a familiar knot form in her stomach. Dinner used to be simple. Now it required strategy. Across the country, women began quietly reworking the family dinner plate. Brown beef stretched further when mixed with rice, oats, or breadcrumbs. Beans and lentils, once considered a poor family staple, started appearing in casseroles served proudly at church potlucks. Nobody called it budgeting. They called it Tuesday. Karen, a mother of 4 in rural Indiana, kept a small card box filled with recipe cards labeled simply stretchers. Each one used less meat than the recipe before it, without sacrificing flavor or making dinner feel like punishment. Her husband never noticed the beef in her casserole had been quietly reduced by a third. Her children asked for seconds. Some families adopted an unspoken rule that would later be given a catchy name: Meatless Mondays. It wasn't a trend. It wasn't a movement with a slogan. It was survival dressed up as tradition. A pot of lentil soup, a skillet of beans and cornbread, a vegetable stew thickened with barley. These dishes filled stomachs without draining wallets. What made this shift remarkable wasn't just the money saved. It was the quiet confidence women gained from realizing they could feed their families well without relying on the most expensive ingredient in the kitchen. Protein, they discovered, didn't have to come from a steak. It could come from a can of black beans costing a fraction of the price, dressed up with spices and a little patience. This lesson echoes loudly into modern kitchens. Today's version wears a different name: meal prepping. Jennifer, a working mother juggling 2 jobs, spends every Sunday afternoon portioning out bean-based chilies and grain bowls into containers for the week ahead. She has no idea her routine mirrors almost exactly what women were doing 50 years earlier out of necessity rather than choice. The difference is that Linda's generation didn't have social media teaching them these tricks. They had each other. Recipe cards passed hand to hand at church basements, whispered tips exchanged over backyard fences, a quiet network of women refusing to let rising prices dictate what their children ate for dinner. But something else was happening alongside the kitchen table adjustments, something that would soon spread from indoor meals to outdoor soil. If protein was getting more expensive, produce wasn't far behind. And one afternoon, while pulling weeds from a small patch of dirt behind her house, Linda's neighbor Nancy stumbled onto an idea that would save her family even more than beans ever could. Nancy hadn't planned to start a garden. She simply couldn't justify paying rising prices for tomatoes she suspected she could grow herself. Her grandmother had kept a victory garden during the war years, and Nancy remembered the stories more clearly than she remembered the taste of store-bought tomatoes that summer. She started small, a few tomato plants along the fence, a row of green beans near the porch steps. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive, just seeds, dirt, and a stubborn refusal to keep watching grocery prices climb without doing something about it. By midsummer, Nancy's backyard had transformed into something that looked less like decoration and more like quiet rebellion. Tomatoes ripened in neat rows, zucchini spread wider than she expected. Herbs grew in coffee cans lined along her windowsill. Her family's grocery bill shrank in ways she hadn't anticipated, and her children began to ask to help pick vegetables instead of asking for snacks from a box. Word spread through the neighborhood the way most good ideas did in 1974, over fences, at church, during coffee hour after Sunday service. Soon, Patricia had her own patch of lettuce growing beside her driveway. Deborah started herbs on her apartment balcony, using nothing more than a few clay pots and a sunny windowsill. What began as one woman's frustration with tomato prices had quietly become a neighborhood habit. This wasn't about becoming a farmer, it was about reclaiming a small piece of control during a time when almost everything else felt uncertain. A garden couldn't fix inflation, but it could put fresh vegetables on the table without a single trip to the produce aisle. And for many women, that small victory mattered more than any headline about the economy. Today, this instinct has returned under a different name: organic living. Sarah, a woman in her early 40s living just outside Phoenix, keeps raised garden beds in her backyard, growing tomatoes and peppers she proudly serves at family dinners. She rarely thinks about where the habit originated. She only knows the vegetables taste better and cost less than anything from the store. What Nancy discovered in 1974 and what Sarah is rediscovering now is the same quiet truth. Self-reliance doesn't require permission from an economy that refuses to cooperate. It only requires soil, patience, and the willingness to try something that feels a little old-fashioned. But growing food solved only part of the problem. Bills still arrived every month, printed in stark black ink, demanding payment regardless of how many tomatoes sat ripening on a windowsill. Linda knew this better than anyone, and it was during one particularly tense evening, staring at a stack of unpaid utility bills spread across her kitchen table, that she remembered something her mother used to do with plain paper envelopes and carefully counted cash. Linda's mother had never trusted banks completely, not after living through stories of hardship passed down from her own parents. Instead, she trusted paper envelopes, a pencil, and careful handwriting. Each payday, she divided her husband's earnings into envelopes labeled simply electric, gas, water, groceries. Whatever remained went into a final envelope marked plainly savings. Linda had rolled her eyes at this system as a teenager. It seemed old-fashioned, almost primitive compared to the convenience of paying bills by check. But sitting at her own kitchen table in 1974, staring at bills she couldn't quite cover, she finally understood the wisdom behind it. She tried it herself the following week. 6 plain envelopes, each labeled in her own handwriting, filled with carefully counted cash the moment her husband's paycheck cleared. The rule was simple and unforgiving. Once an envelope was empty, spending in that category stopped completely. No borrowing from groceries to cover gas, no convincing herself it was just this once. The first month felt uncomfortable. The second month felt manageable. By the third month, something remarkable happened. Linda noticed money left over in the utilities envelope, money that hadn't existed under her old system of vague mental math and hopeful guessing. She wasn't spending less because she was suffering. She was spending less because she could finally see exactly where every dollar was going. This visual honesty was the entire secret. A checkbook hid spending behind abstract numbers on a page. Cash in an envelope made spending physical, tangible, impossible to ignore. When the electric envelope grew thin, Linda simply turned off lights a little earlier. When the grocery envelope ran low, she adjusted that week's menu without a single ounce of shame. Compare this to modern spending habits. Michelle, a mother in her late 30s managing a household budget through 3 different banking apps, admits she often loses track of exactly how much she spent until her monthly statement arrives, already too late to adjust. Credit cards and tap-to-pay convenience have made spending nearly invisible, a quiet tap replacing the weight of counted bills. Linda's envelope system didn't require an app, a subscription, or a single dollar spent on software. It required only discipline and a stack of plain paper envelopes from the drugstore. And yet it accomplished something modern budgeting tools still struggled to replicate. It made spending feel real again. But envelopes solved the money side of the equation. Another problem remained, quieter but just as persistent. Household products, cleaners, and everyday items were climbing in price just as quickly as groceries. And it was in a neighbor's kitchen cabinet, of all places, that Linda discovered the next piece of the forgotten puzzle. Barbara, a widow living 2 houses down from Linda, had never bought a bottle of glass cleaner in her life. Her kitchen cabinet held something far simpler: white vinegar, baking soda, and a stack of old rags cut from worn-out T-shirts. When Linda visited one afternoon, complaining about the rising cost of cleaning supplies, Barbara simply laughed and handed her a spray bottle filled with diluted vinegar. "This cleans better than anything from the store," Barbara said, "and it costs about a penny a bottle." Linda was skeptical at first, the same way she'd been skeptical of generic peanut butter. But desperation is a powerful teacher. She tried the vinegar solution on her windows. They came out streak-free, brighter than she expected. Baking soda scrubbed her sink clean without the harsh chemical smell she'd grown used to. What had once required an entire cabinet of expensive bottles now required 2 ingredients most households already owned. This wasn't a trend born from environmental concern, the way it might be marketed today. It was born from necessity, from women refusing to pay premium prices for products they could recreate at home for pennies. Recipes passed between neighbors the way family stories did, adjusted slightly by each woman who tried them, perfected through trial and error rather than instructions from a magazine. Around the same time, Linda noticed something else changing in her neighborhood. Clothes that once would have been discarded were being mended instead. A torn hem became an opportunity, not a reason to visit the store. Lisa, a young mother down the street, turned her husband's worn-out work shirts into aprons and patchwork quilts rather than throwing them away. What she couldn't repair, she repurposed into something new entirely. This mend it or repurpose it mindset stood in sharp contrast to the disposable culture creeping into American households through convenient, cheaply made goods. Clothing wasn't meant to be worn once and discarded. It was meant to be cared for, patched, and passed down. Today, this same instinct has resurfaced under a fashionable new label, sustainable fashion. Emily, a woman in her 30s living in Seattle, proudly thrifts and repairs her own clothing, sharing her projects online without realizing how closely her habits mirror what Lisa was doing in her living room 50 years earlier out of financial necessity rather than aesthetic choice. The line between frugality and creativity had nearly disappeared. Necessity had quietly become skill, and skill had quietly become pride. But one more lesson remained, one that involved not just individual households, but entire neighborhoods working together in ways that modern shoppers have almost completely forgotten. It started with a simple conversation between Linda and three of her neighbors standing in a driveway comparing grocery receipts on a Saturday morning. Each woman had noticed the same pattern. Buying in bulk saved money, but no single family needed 50 pounds of flour or a case of canned tomatoes all at once. The solution seemed obvious once someone finally said it out loud. Why not buy together? Within a month, 6 families in Linda's neighborhood had formed an informal buying club. Once a month, someone drove to a wholesale supplier and purchased large quantities of staples: flour, sugar, canned goods, cleaning supplies. The cost was split evenly, and each family walked away with exactly what they needed at a fraction of the retail price. Nancy handled the flour and sugar. Patricia coordinated canned vegetables. Deborah kept a careful ledger, recording exactly who paid what, ensuring nobody felt shortchanged. It wasn't formal. There was no paperwork, no business license, nothing beyond trust and a shared notebook passed between kitchens. But it worked, month after month, saving each family money that used to disappear into higher per-unit prices at the local grocery store. This idea feels strikingly familiar today, just dressed in a different uniform. Modern warehouse clubs like Costco operate on nearly identical logic, buying in bulk to lower the per-unit cost. The difference is that Linda's generation built this system themselves, out of a driveway conversation and a shared notebook, without a membership card or a corporate warehouse involved at all. But as the months passed, Linda noticed something even more valuable emerging from all of this, something harder to measure than dollars saved or ounces compared. It was a shift in mindset, quiet and gradual, spreading through every woman who joined her in this new way of living. They stopped measuring their worth by what they could buy. They started measuring it by what they could manage, stretch, and create with what they already had. A generic brand wasn't a failure. A mended shirt wasn't a sign of poverty. A garden wasn't a chore. Each represented something deeper, control in a world that felt increasingly out of control. Linda began calling it, privately in her notebook, the psychology of making do. Not making do out of despair, but making do as a quiet form of confidence. Every dollar saved through unit pricing, every meal stretched with beans instead of beef, every envelope carefully rationed became proof that she could handle whatever the economy threw at her family next. This mindset feels remarkably close to something modern women are rediscovering right now, often without realizing its origin: minimalism. The idea that less can genuinely mean more, that contentment doesn't require constant acquisition, that security comes from skill and discipline rather than income alone. And it was this exact realization, the one Linda wrote in her notebook late one night, that would become the most important lesson of the entire story. By the end of that difficult year, Linda's notebook had filled with prices, recipes, envelope totals, and garden notes. But flipping back through its pages one quiet evening, she noticed something she hadn't expected to find. The entries weren't just about saving money. They were a record of confidence being rebuilt, page by page, habit by habit. Here was the lesson hiding beneath every other lesson. None of these habits worked because of a single clever trick. They worked because each one restored a small piece of control during a time when everything felt uncertain. Unit pricing gave Linda control over what she bought. The envelope system gave her control over what she spent. The garden gave her control over what her family ate. The buying club gave her control shared with neighbors who trusted each other completely. Control, not cash, was the real currency her generation had rediscovered. And that quiet realization mattered more than any single dollar saved. Linda's daughter grew up watching all of this happen at the kitchen table, absorbing these habits without ever being formally taught them. Decades later, during her own difficult stretch of rising prices and tightening budgets, she found herself reaching for an envelope instead of a credit card, almost instinctively, the way her mother once had. That is the quiet inheritance this story leaves behind. Not a fortune, not a guaranteed outcome, simply a set of forgotten habits, patient and unglamorous, that gave ordinary women back a sense of control during extraordinary financial pressure. The 1970s didn't hand these women easy answers. It handed them discipline, and discipline turned out to be enough. Today, as grocery bills climb again and paychecks feel stretched thinner than they used to, these same forgotten habits are quietly resurfacing in kitchens across America. Unit pricing, envelope budgeting, home gardens, mended clothing, shared bulk purchases. None of it is complicated. All of it is proven, tested not by theory, but by women who lived through it and came out the other side with their families intact and their confidence stronger than before. Linda never became wealthy from any of this. That was never the goal. What she gained instead was something steadier, the quiet knowledge that she could handle whatever came next, one careful envelope, one honest receipt, one homegrown tomato at a time. So here's a question worth sitting with. Do you think families today would feel more financially secure if they returned to using cash envelopes and unit pricing the way women did back in 1974? If this story reminded you of your own mother or grandmother's kitchen table wisdom, share it in the comments below. Subscribe for more forgotten lessons from the past, and let us know which habit from this story you'd be willing to try this week.